Well, last week we launched into an introduction to the book of Acts, and we did so. We looked at the writer, who is Luke, the doctor. We examined his trustworthiness as an historian to be writing this document. And we even looked at those who were sceptical. We noted the great world-famous archaeologist Sir William Ramsay, who was a pioneer in the archaeological expedition in the area of the New Testament locations. And he is a guy who was qualified, and yet he, as Sir William Ramsay of Oxford University, said that Luke was not reliable, that there is no historical trustworthiness in the book of Acts, and that it was just something written in the 2nd century, and that was his skepticism. He was a skeptic who determined that, he presupposed that before he began his some 30 years of expedition, archaeological exploration, and at the conclusion of that 30 years, he came up with a different view. That's where we left off last week. Let's just see a small quote from Sir William Ramsay we looked at last week. Luke, writer of Acts, is an historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. So, as we're entering into the book of Acts, we're entering into the world that Luke lived and breathed and recorded and spoke to people and saw with his own eyes. And we're entering into the world that the apostles lived and breathed and ministered and suffered. And we're going to learn what it's like to be a follower of Jesus back there in the 1st century when this was written. Now, as we looked at last week, there are 2 volumes that Luke wrote, Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And we also noted that in the ancient world, when someone wrote multiple volumes, that the introduction to the first volume did duty for both volumes. So again, we're going to have another look at the real introduction to the book of Acts, which is the start of Luke's Gospel. Again, let's look at it. Luke chapter 1, verse 1. Luke says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the very first, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." So he's saying, I've carefully investigated, I'm writing an orderly account. How does he do that? By checking with eyewitnesses, he says. From the beginning, he says. Now, if he did that, then he must have interviewed the apostles. In fact, we know, and we're going to find out, that Luke was actually an associate, travelling companion of the apostle Paul. First-hand information. But he must have also interviewed people like Mary, the mother of Jesus. Because when Luke gives some of the description, some of the things he starts off his gospel are things like the angels appearing to Mary and Mary's version of the genealogy. Things like that tell us that Luke must have spoken to Mary because she was the only one who was there. And so he's gone to the sources, and we're going to see Mary here in this early part of book of Acts as well. But Luke checked with the eyewitnesses, the people who were there. Now, we noted last week that Luke is a Gentile, but the first half of Acts is given from a very Jewish perspective. How does that work? Well, again, because he got his information from the eyewitnesses, the apostles themselves, who were all Jewish. So we see that in the first half, his sources, his eyewitness accounts come from the apostles. Now, despite Luke's literary prowess, his education, sophistication we looked at last week, we also see that in this book of Acts we're going to see him willing to get his hands dirty, to get down and do some of the work himself, because Luke is not only writing the accounts of others, he also is a fellow companion and traveller with the Apostle Paul, and he even spent time in jail. He's supported his friend Paul, who calls him a friend. Look at Colossians 4 verse 14. Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings. So that's Paul writing about his dear friend Luke. In fact, when Paul was languishing in prison for the gospel, and everyone else had left him, and everyone else had either deserted him or gone on to other things, you want to know what loyalty is? Picture the lonely Apostle Paul, who is stuck there in prison, and you can almost feel the pathos crying out off the pages when he writes to Timothy, and he says, there's only one faithful friend is still left with me. Read it in 2 Timothy 4 verse 10. The Apostle Paul says, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Luke, doctor, the academic, the historian, the writer, was in prison voluntarily just to be there to support the Apostle Paul out of loyalty to Christ and loyalty to his friend Paul. We're going to see how Luke has researched his material because we're going to get these accounts from the apostles and others. But in other parts of Acts, we're going to see first-hand information when Luke himself is the eyewitness, because we're going to see a shift in pronouns in this book of Acts, where he's describing events. They went here, they did this, they went there, and then it shifts to what we call the we passages. That is, all of a sudden, he starts saying, we sailed here, we travelled there, we did this. In other words, Luke says, I was there. I'm writing first-hand information. He's there in the action himself. And as that introduction said, he carefully investigated everything from the beginning, and he told Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. So what's the primary way he can guarantee certainty? What's the primary way? Eyewitnesses. I got my information from the eyewitnesses. And we just need to reflect on that for a moment, because witnesses are one of the primary things that God, in a practical sense, gives to the world to reveal himself. God provides witness to who he is. He does it profoundly in the creation of the world. When people, even the atheists, has got to look out the window and cover their eyes, because I can't imagine, where did this come from? That's what we ask, isn't it? Even the agnostic, I don't know, but wow, where did all this come from? Someone must have started it. And that's what Romans 1 verse 9 and 20 says, isn't it? That since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, even though God's invisible, he has made himself clearly known by the things that have been made, so that man is without excuse. In other words, God provides a witness that when you stand before God on the day of judgment, you can never say, I didn't know God existed. Yes, you did. All you have to do is look out the window and say, where did all this come from? So God provides a witness in creation, but he goes much further than that. He provides a witness in sending his Son to come into history, right into history. And not only to just come into history to reveal who God is, but of course to come in, to become one of us, that he might provide us salvation through his substitutionary death on the cross and resurrection. But even that is confirmed by eyewitnesses. The history of that is laid down when Jesus rose from the dead and everything. It was the history of that is laid down by eyewitnesses, as we read in the Gospels. In the Old Testament, God called on his people to be a witness to him. We just read before in Isaiah 43, you are my witnesses. And now here we are in the New Testament, and what are these last words that Jesus says to his disciples before he leaves them? And we note that Jesus here is saying the very thing that God said in the Old Testament to the 12 tribes. Here, the living God as the Son is telling not the 12 tribes of Israel, but his 12 apostles. Acts chapter 1, verse 8, last half says, Jesus says, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And here we are, Fitzroy North, at the ends of the earth. Australia is like, have you thought about that? We're 2,000 years on from when Jesus said these words, and we are literally at the other end of the earth. And what are we doing here? What are we doing here? How did it all come about that we would be here today believing in some Near Eastern Jewish religion at the other end of the earth? Because of the eyewitnesses. Because of the eyewitnesses. That's the practical sense that God has used. The very people who were there and saw these events with their own eyes. We've got this information from the very people to whom Jesus said, you are my witnesses to the ends of the earth. And Acts is their story. This idea of witness and true witness is central to the justice system of God throughout the whole of the Old Testament. We need at least 2 or 3 witnesses to establish an event. What about one of the very 10 commandments, the 9th commandment? You shall not give false witness or testimony. The critical nature of witness to provide, and as God says, every matter must be established by 2 or 3 witnesses. Have you ever wondered why we've got 4 Gospels and 3 of them are what we call the synoptic, very similar? You know, an unbeliever reads, or a new believer reads the Bible for the first New Testament, first time gets to Matthew, then gets on to Mark and goes, hey, haven't I just read this? This is same sort of stuff. And then Luke, he's repeating stuff too. What's all that about? It's because God is providing, not just one, but witnesses. Witnesses. Now, the difficulty, of course, with the idea of witnesses is some people lie. People can commit perjury. Is God relying on human beings who can not always tell the truth? The heart is deceitful above all things. Well, it seems that God knows there's one occasion where all of a sudden human beings, whoever they are, suddenly have the power, the ability to be able to tell the truth absolutely every single time. All you've got to do is stick a gun to their head. All you got to do is have their lives on the line, and suddenly people have this ability to tell the truth. And we're going to meet in Acts these very people. We're going to see them die before our eyes. We're going to see the very first Christian martyrs, the witnesses who signed their testimony in their own blood. True witnesses even unto death. And this is one of the things that sets Christianity apart from other religions. When your friends say, what's the difference? Well, there are a lot of differences, aren't there? A lot of important differences. But what's the difference? Everybody's saying they've got the right God and all that sort of stuff. One practical difference is that you can say only Christianity is based on witnesses. Now you go, hang on a minute, there's all others claim witnesses. Have a closer look. No, they don't. You know, in actual fact, you look at the other religions, and at first it seems more impressive, like the fact that Jesus never actually, we don't have anything that Jesus wrote. We don't have any of his, he didn't write the Gospels. And you compare that with the other religions, and they do. You know, the founder of Islam, Muhammad, he saw an angel in the cave or whatever, and he wrote down, the angel told him, Quran, recite. And he wrote down all this stuff and became the Quran. And that's where it all begins. Same with Joseph Smith, founder of Mormonism, second richest religion in the world. And he had this vision, and he wrote down all this, you know, these accounts of all these sorts of things. You know, and you have the Buddhist sages who write down their teachings. But we've got no record of Jesus writing. And at first, it sounds more powerful if you got the writing of the actual person. Isn't that, you know, first source sort of thing? Sounds better until you start thinking about it. Muhammad was in the cave, saw an angel. Who else was there? How do we know he wasn't having a hallucination, or as some modern medical people say, an epileptic fit or whatever? How do you know, as Muhammad himself at first thought, that he was demon-possessed or that he was just sincerely misguided? There are no other witnesses. There is no one else there to say there was an angel appeared. There's zero witnesses. Joseph Smith, he says he had this vision. In fact, the account of the vision seems to change a little bit. You know, God the Father, the Son, blah, blah, blah. And trouble is, who else was there? What other witnesses have you got? Who verifies what he actually saw? Jesus, in contrast, comes into history and publicly puts on display miracles that even his enemies did not try and deny that he did them, but tried to attribute them to the devil or something. But no one could deny it because he did it publicly before eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses. Jesus didn't just defy creation and prove he was God. He did it before eyewitnesses. And the New Testament and the Gospels and the letters are written down by eyewitnesses who were friends, but also were enemies and unbelievers who had clearly been convinced after they'd seen the risen Christ. Witness after witness, and coming back to the guarantee that people will tell the truth. They signed their testimony, their witness in their own blood. They were willing to die, and most of them did die for the sake of maintaining their witness that this was true. And here we are reading Jesus' last words to them in Acts chapter 1 verse 8 again. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And sure enough, they were. They turned the world upside down. When we went through the Gospel of John, we saw after Jesus' death that these guys, these followers of Jesus, apostles, huddled in the room, scaredy cats that someone might come after us now. But all of a sudden they were transformed. They were transformed into this powerful witness that nothing could stop, even to the ends of the earth. What transformed them? Well, come to Acts chapter 1 verse 3. And after Jesus' suffering, he showed himself to these men and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God on one occasion while he was eating with them. And I cut that off there deliberately. I want you to think about that. Notice that this is not some hallucination that one person saw, like a Joseph Smith and or a Muhammad in the cave. They were all there together and they were eating with someone who they knew was dead and is now alive. Many convincing proofs, says Luke in Acts 1:3. And this is where Acts is picking up from where the resurrection left off 40 days earlier. Jesus tells them, you'll be my witnesses to the world, and then something else happens that they witness with their own eyes. Acts chapter 1 verse 9. After he said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. That means they literally are standing there. He says, you're going to be my witnesses. And you reckon they could have remembered this happening? This is not Michael Jordan. Boy, that guy can jump, you know. This is not, just Spider-Man climbing up the wall. There is no wall. Right before their eyes. And they were never the same since. Their last words that they heard him say to them, you are my witnesses. And then he's rising up right before their very eyes. This one that they'd seen him defy the creation, walking on water and stilling the storm. But now he's defying gravity itself, going up into the air. And you notice in verse 9 it said in a cloud. That would have spoken to the disciples. Remember, they were Jewish guys who knew their Old Testament. So what does the cloud in the Old Testament remind us of? The Lord in the glory cloud. And here is the Lord himself rising up before our very eyes. They would never be the same again. And that empowered them, as we're going to see in this book of Acts, where they become so bold. They're not worried about life or death. And I pray that after we get through Acts, we'll be emboldened in the same way. That by faith, we will believe these eyewitnesses that Jesus literally rose up, that he is God incarnate. And we're about to enter into their lives, the guys that did turn the world upside down. As chapter 1 verse 8 says, they were a witness to the ends of the earth. Because that's really a strange comment if you can just set it in its context. If you can just think back to way back in the Near East in the 1st century, And some rabbis telling these fishermen and the like, and a tax collector and a few other shady characters, listen, you guys are going to take this message to the ends of the earth. Really? And yet, here we are, we've got the evidence before our eyes, because we are here, as we said, at the ends of the earth, literally. But think about what Jesus, in those words, what impact that had as we look back on 2,000 years now, with Christianity now, after, 12 guys, in the, or 11 of them at that stage were there, and then here we are with Christianity being by far the largest religion in the world. 1 in 3 people and walk the face of the earth claim to follow him. A whole lot more have been influenced, in even the unbelievers soak in all of the influence of Christ. They lap it up and got no idea where it even came from, because they're calling out. What are they calling for? Justice. They're calling out for fairness. They call out for equality. We want equality. Where'd you get that idea from? Oh, well, everybody believes it. Oh, really? Just take a look at history. Just take a look at much of the world living right now that does not understand those concepts. How did it get here? It came back to the one who started this witness to the world of his teaching. Do unto others. Where do you get that from? What a weird idea. Well, it is weird to much of the world, but these witnesses did, in fact, turn the world upside down. It did reach the ends of the earth. And these people are the people that Luke the doctor knew personally. And he recorded these events. And these are the people we're going to journey through within the book of Acts. As F.F. Bruce can say, Acts is a source book of the highest value for the history of civilization. Interesting thought, the history of civilization. Like all the stuff that we, especially the Western world, just take for granted, that we don't need this Christianity, but we still want fairness, we still want do unto others, where did it come from? History of civilization. But if Luke writes an accurate history of these events, then they have far more importance than just the history of civilization. The angels told the disciples in verse 11, Jesus will come back in the same way. So this is a little bit more than just historical academic exercise here. Because if it's just as certain that Jesus rose up before their eyes, it's just as certain he's coming back. But this time, not to save, but to judge. You and I don't know when that is. You and I don't even know when our last breath is going to be taken. We may not even make it through the rest of this day. God forbid we all get home safely. But if you don't, what are you going to do when you stand before God? He will say, I gave you a witness. I told you. I gave my son to go to that cross, to take your sin away. That if you repent and believe in him, that you will receive a rich welcome in that eternal existence. But you will not be able to say that God did not give me a witness, that God did not testify to himself. And it's what we do with this history as we get into this book of Acts that's going to affect our eternal destiny. So come with me as we get into the book of Acts and lay down by these witnesses, you will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth.